December 29th, 2019. Kansai International Airport, Japan. Hidden inside a wooden audio equipment case, breathing through strategically drilled air holes, Carlos Ghosn, former CEO of the world's largest automotive alliance, escaped house arrest, private jet, Istanbul, Beirut, freedom. The world watched in shock. Japan's justice system humiliated. A billionaire fugitive living in a mansion protected by a country with no extradition treaty. But Ghosn's escape solved nothing, because what he left behind was far worse than anyone imagined. $1 billion missing. And the stealing? It never stopped. Carlos Ghosn was untouchable. That's what everyone thought. The man who saved Nissan from bankruptcy in 1999. The architect of the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance, the world's largest automotive group, selling 10.76 million vehicles annually. A man who spoke 5 languages, held passports from 3 countries, and commanded a compensation package that would eventually total over $200 million. But on November 19th, 2018, Japanese authorities did the unthinkable. They arrested him, not for poor business decisions, not for executive excess, for fraud, for embezzlement, for systematically looting one of Japan's most iconic companies over nearly 2 decades. The charges were staggering: underreporting his compensation by $80 million, transferring investment losses to Nissan, using company funds to buy luxury homes in Beirut, Rio de Janeiro, Paris, and Amsterdam, a yacht, private jets, lavish parties at Versailles, all on Nissan's dime. Then came the escape, the audio case, the humiliation, the press conferences from Lebanon where Ghosn painted himself as a victim of a corporate coup and a xenophobic Japanese justice system. The world debated, was he a visionary businessman persecuted by rivals, or a sophisticated thief who finally got caught? Here's why you should care. If you have a 401k, an IRA, or any mutual fund that invests in international stocks, there's a very real chance you own or owned Nissan shares. When this scandal broke, the company lost $40 billion in market value. Pension funds, college endowment funds, retirement accounts, all devastated. This isn't just about billionaires in boardrooms. This is about your money, your retirement, your future. But here's what the media missed while covering Ghosn's dramatic getaway. The embezzlement didn't stop when he fled Japan. In fact, investigators would soon discover it got worse, much worse. To understand how deep this corruption runs, we have to go back to 1999. Nissan was dying. The company had $20 billion in debt. Market share was collapsing. Dealerships were closing. The Japanese government was considering a bailout. That's when Renault sent Carlos Ghosn, a 45-year-old Brazilian-born, French-educated executive with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Within months, he slashed 21,000 jobs, closed 5 factories, and eliminated entire product lines. The Japanese media called him the cost killer. Workers hated him, but it worked. By 2001, Nissan was profitable again. By 2005, Ghosn was CEO of both Nissan and Renault simultaneously, an unprecedented arrangement. By 2017, he added Mitsubishi to the alliance, creating the world's largest automotive group. He was a celebrity CEO magazine covers, best-selling books, a manga comic series in Japan celebrating his achievements. But behind the success story, something else was growing. An empire of corruption so sophisticated, so deeply embedded in Nissan's financial systems, that it would take years to uncover. Ghosn didn't steal alone. He couldn't have. What prosecutors discovered was a carefully constructed machine, a shadow financial system running parallel to Nissan's legitimate operations. It started with something simple: executive compensation. In Japan, companies must publicly disclose executive pay above 100 million yen, roughly $1 million. Ghosn was making far more than that, so he created a system to hide it. He structured his compensation across multiple jurisdictions. Salaries paid through Nissan subsidiaries in the Netherlands, consulting fees routed through shell companies in Lebanon, stock options granted through entities in the British Virgin Islands. When Japanese regulators looked at Nissan's filings, they saw a compensation package of about $10 million annually. The real number? Closer to $20 million, sometimes more. But that was just the beginning. Ghosn used Nissan funds to purchase luxury properties around the world, not in the company's name, but through entities he controlled. A $70 million mansion in Beirut, a luxury apartment in Rio with sweeping ocean views, a penthouse in Paris, an Amsterdam canal house. Official explanation: corporate housing for the CEO. Reality: personal assets purchased with corporate money. And it wasn't just real estate. There was a yacht, the shachu, Japanese for company president, moored in the Mediterranean. Private jets flying his family on vacation. A $4.4 million payment to his personal attorney in Lebanon, disguised as a consulting fee to a company called Good Faith Investments. But the most brazen scheme: In 2008, during the financial crisis, Ghosn had personally invested in currency derivatives that went south. He was facing losses of about $16 million, so he transferred the contracts to Nissan. The company absorbed his personal losses. Later, when investigators questioned him about it, he claimed it was a legitimate hedging strategy for the company. The problem? Nissan had no need for those particular derivatives. They existed solely to cover Ghosn's gambling losses. This wasn't a CEO taking advantage of loose expense policies. This was systematic embezzlement masked as corporate governance. None of this could have happened without help. And that's where the story gets darker. Because when Japanese prosecutors started pulling on threads, they found an entire network of executives who knew exactly what was happening and helped make it possible. The first name that emerged, Greg Kelly, an American lawyer who had worked at Nissan since 1988. He rose to become a board member and Ghosn's closest aide. Kelly's role was simple but critical. He structured the compensation schemes that hid Ghosn's true pay. He created the deferred compensation agreements. He arranged the payments through offshore entities. When Ghosn was arrested in November 2018, Kelly was arrested the same day, same airport, same charges. The message was clear: you enable this, you pay too. Then there was Hari Nada, former head of Nissan's CEO office, the man who knew every detail of Ghosn's financial arrangements because he helped manage them. But Nada did something Kelly didn't. He cooperated. In exchange for immunity, he gave prosecutors everything: email chains, financial documents, meeting notes, testimony about conversations where Ghosn explicitly instructed subordinates to conceal his compensation. Nada's testimony would prove devastating. It wasn't just about what Ghosn did. It was about how many people inside Nissan knew and said nothing. The corporate culture wasn't just permissive, it was complicit. But while the world focused on Ghosn's escape, the private jets, the mansion in Lebanon, the international manhunt, Japanese prosecutors were uncovering something far more disturbing. The fraud didn't end with Ghosn. It was still happening. And the amount? It was staggering. January 2020. While Ghosn was holding press conferences in Beirut, painting himself as a persecuted visionary, forensic accountants in Tokyo were doing something far less theatrical, but infinitely more important. They were following the money. And what they found shocked even the most cynical investigators. The schemes they had already documented, the underreported compensation, the personal use of company assets, the derivatives fraud, those were just the surface. Underneath was a labyrinth of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fabricated invoices stretching across 3 continents. Start with the real estate. Investigators knew about the Beirut mansion and the Rio apartment, but as they dug deeper, they found something more sophisticated. Ghosn hadn't just used Nissan money to buy these properties. He had created an entire ecosystem of entities to obscure the transactions. One company, registered in the British Virgin Islands and funded entirely by Nissan, purchased the Beirut property for approximately $70 million. Official documents described it as an executive residence for business development in the Middle East. But Ghosn's family lived there. His son held parties there. Nissan executives? They never used it. But the real revelation came when investigators examined Nissan's relationship with a network of companies based in Dubai and Lebanon. The evidence was hiding in plain sight. Here's what they missed for years. Between 2010 and 2018, Nissan had paid approximately $50 million to a Lebanese company called Good Faith Investments. The stated purpose? Consulting services for Middle Eastern market expansion. The reality? Good Faith Investments was controlled by Ghosn's personal attorney and close friend, Fadi Gibran. What consulting work did Good Faith Investments actually do? Nobody could say. There were no reports, no deliverables, no documentation of any services rendered, just wire transfers, millions of dollars flowing from Nissan to a company that did nothing except exist. And it got worse. Investigators found that Ghosn had arranged for Nissan to guarantee a personal investment he made in a Lebanese startup. When that startup went under, guess who absorbed the losses? Not Ghosn, Nissan, to the tune of $14 million. As the evidence mounted, prosecutors began to see the full picture. This wasn't one man stealing. This was an organization within an organization, a shadow corporate structure where loyalty to Ghosn trumped loyalty to Nissan, its shareholders, or Japanese law. Greg Kelly's trial began in September 2020. It would last 2.5 years. The charges were specific: conspiracy to underreport Ghosn's compensation by approximately $90 million between 2010 and 2018. Kelly's defense was simple. The payments were legitimate deferred compensation, and Japanese law at the time didn't require disclosure of deferred amounts. But prosecutors had the receipts, literally. They produced emails where Kelly discussed how to structure payments to avoid disclosure requirements. They showed how Kelly had created multiple compensation agreements, some official, some hidden. They demonstrated that Kelly knew the agreements were designed to conceal, not defer. In March 2023, the verdict came down guilty. Kelly was sentenced to 6 months in prison, suspended for 4 years, meaning he wouldn't serve time unless he committed another crime. He was also hit with a fine and ordered to pay damages to Nissan. The sentence was light by Japanese standards, but the message was clear. Enablers would be held accountable. But Kelly wasn't alone. As the investigation expanded, more names surfaced. Toshiaki Onuma, a former aide to Ghosn, was charged with aggravated breach of trust for his role in transferring company funds to entities controlled by Ghosn. Other executives began cooperating with prosecutors, revealing layers of the scheme that even insiders didn't fully understand. The full scope. So how much did Carlos Ghosn actually steal from Nissan? The honest answer? We may never know the full amount, but we can break down what prosecutors have documented. First, the underreported compensation. Approximately $80 million between 2010 and 2018. This is based on the difference between what Nissan disclosed to regulators and what internal documents showed Ghosn actually received or was promised. Second, personal use of company funds, conservatively estimated at $100 million. This includes the luxury properties, the yacht, the private jets, lavish entertainment expenses, and payments to family members disguised as consulting fees. Third, the questionable consulting contracts to companies like Good Faith Investments, at least $50 million that investigators could directly trace. Fourth, the derivatives fraud and questionable investments, where Nissan absorbed Ghosn's personal losses, approximately $30 million. Add it all up, and you're looking at a minimum of $260 million in documented fraud. But investigators believe this is only what they could prove. The actual amount? Some estimates put it over $1 billion when you include the broader network of payments, the diminished shareholder value, and the corporate resources diverted to serve Ghosn's personal interests. $1 billion. Let that sink in. To put it in perspective, that's more than the GDP of several small countries. It's enough to build 4 entire automobile manufacturing plants. It's enough to fund Nissan's R&D division for an entire year, and it was systematically stolen over 2 decades. You might think the story ends there. Ghosn fled, Kelly convicted, case closed, but you'd be wrong. Because in 2024, Japanese prosecutors dropped a bombshell that proved the corruption at Nissan didn't end with Ghosn's escape. It evolved. In March 2024, new indictments were filed against several current and former Nissan executives. The charges: ongoing financial misconduct related to the same systems Ghosn had established. Investigators discovered that after Ghosn fled, some of his shadow financial infrastructure remained operational. Shell companies that should have been shut down were still receiving Nissan funds. Consulting agreements that should have been terminated were still being honored. Even more shocking, some executives had used the chaos following Ghosn's arrest to divert additional funds. While the company was in crisis mode, while investigators were combing through records, while the media was focused on the escape, new schemes were being executed. The investigation expanded internationally. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission launched its own inquiry, examining whether Nissan's American operations had been used to facilitate the fraud. French authorities opened investigations into Renault's role. Lebanese officials, despite protecting Ghosn from extradition, began investigating the local companies that had received Nissan payments. And just when prosecutors thought they had mapped the full scope of the conspiracy, a new revelation emerged that would shake the automotive industry to its core. The fraud hadn't just enriched individuals, it had brought one of the world's most iconic car companies to its knees. November 19th, 2018, the day Ghosn was arrested. Nissan's stock price, Y1,464 per share. Market capitalization, approximately $38 billion. 1 year later, after the escape, after the revelations, after the scandal had fully metastasized in the public consciousness, Nissan's stock price had collapsed to Y640 per share. The company had lost over $15 billion in market value. That's $15 billion in wealth, held by pension funds, retirement accounts, mutual funds, simply gone. But the stock price was just the beginning. Credit rating agencies moved quickly. Moody's downgraded Nissan's credit rating twice in 2019, citing governance concerns and operational challenges. S&P followed suit. Suddenly, borrowing costs increased. Financing new projects became more expensive. The company's ability to invest in electric vehicle development and autonomous driving technology, the future of the automotive industry, was severely compromised. Then came the layoffs. In 2019, Nissan announced it would cut 2,500 jobs globally, roughly 9% of its workforce. Production capacity would be reduced by 10%. Factories in Barcelona, Indonesia, and the United States faced closure or significant downsizing. These weren't strategic adjustments. This was crisis management. Behind those numbers were people, real people whose lives were destroyed by decisions they had no part in making. Take the factory workers in Yokohama. Many had worked for Nissan for decades. They had survived the near bankruptcy in the 1990s. They had weathered the 2008 financial crisis. They had believed the company was stable, that their jobs were secure, that their pensions were safe. Then came the scandal. Thousands lost their jobs. But that wasn't the worst part. Many had invested their retirement savings in Nissan stock, a company benefit that was supposed to ensure financial security. When the stock price collapsed, their nest eggs evaporated. Retirements were delayed, dreams deferred, financial security destroyed. Dealerships suffered too. Independent Nissan dealers, particularly in smaller markets, faced declining sales as the scandal damaged the brand's reputation. Some dealerships, family-owned businesses operating for generations, were forced to close. Others barely survived, sustained only by selling used cars and servicing existing vehicles. And then there were the suppliers, small and medium-sized companies that manufactured parts exclusively for Nissan. When Nissan cut production, these suppliers lost their primary customer. Some declared bankruptcy. Others laid off workers. The ripple effects of Ghosn's fraud extended far beyond Nissan's own payroll. The Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance, once Ghosn's greatest achievement, once the world's largest automotive group, began to crack. The fundamental problem: the alliance was built around Carlos Ghosn. He was the bridge between French and Japanese corporate cultures. He was the arbiter of disputes. He was the vision. Without him, and with the scandal-poisoning relationships, the alliance became a liability rather than an asset. Renault and Nissan began feuding over governance structures. Nissan executives, already resentful of Renault's dominant shareholding position, used the scandal to push for greater independence. Joint projects were delayed. Technology sharing slowed. The cooperation that had once given the alliance competitive advantages started to dissolve. Mitsubishi, the alliance's smallest and most vulnerable member, found itself caught in the middle. The company had joined the alliance in 2016, hoping for stability and shared resources. Instead, it inherited a crisis. Mitsubishi's stock price fell in tandem with Nissan's, despite having no direct involvement in the fraud. Who could replace Carlos Ghosn? That question plagued Nissan for years. Hiroto Saikawa, Ghosn's handpicked successor, became CEO after the arrest. But Saikawa had his own problems. In September 2019, it was revealed that Saikawa had himself received improper compensation, though nowhere near Ghosn's scale. He resigned, his tenure lasting less than a year after formally taking the top job. The board appointed Makoto Uchida as the new CEO in December 2019. Uchida inherited a nightmare, a demoralized workforce, a damaged brand, evaporating market share, a criminal investigation, and the impossible task of restoring trust while cutting costs and competing in an industry undergoing its greatest transformation in a century. The boardroom battles were vicious. Factions formed. Some directors wanted aggressive restructuring. Others pushed for a merger with Renault. Still others argued for breaking up the alliance entirely and returning Nissan to full Japanese control. Every decision was complicated by the ongoing investigations and the toxic legacy of the Ghosn era. Regulators worldwide took notice. If corruption on this scale could happen at Nissan, a well-established, publicly traded, globally recognized company, where else was it happening? Japan's Financial Services Agency launched a comprehensive review of Nissan's financial controls. The findings were damning. Internal audit functions had been compromised. Board oversight was essentially non-existent. Executive compensation was opaque. Related party transactions were inadequately reviewed. In 2019, Nissan paid a fine of why I wish to not to, $4.22 billion to Japanese regulators for violations of financial disclosure laws. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission also imposed penalties, though smaller, for misleading American investors about Ghosn's compensation and the company's internal controls. But more significant than the fines were the reforms regulators demanded. Nissan was required to overhaul its board structure, implementing independent directors with no ties to management. Executive compensation had to be disclosed in granular detail. Internal audit functions had to report directly to the board, not management. Related party transactions required independent review. These weren't suggestions, they were mandates, and Nissan had no choice but to comply. Meanwhile, Carlos Ghosn sat in his Lebanese mansion, untouchable. Lebanon has no extradition treaty with Japan. Interpol issued a red notice, essentially an international arrest warrant, but it was meaningless as long as Ghosn stayed in Lebanon. He gave interviews, he wrote a book, he appeared in documentary films. Always the same narrative. He was a victim, a scapegoat for a corporate coup orchestrated by Japanese executives who resented his plans to merge Nissan and Renault. He claimed the charges were fabricated, the evidence planted, the entire case a conspiracy. But the evidence told a different story. The forensic accountants found the money trails. The prosecutors had the documents. Kelly's conviction confirmed that at least some of the schemes were real and illegal. Ghosn could claim persecution all he wanted. The facts remained unchanged. He may never face trial. He may never spend a day in prison, but But his legacy? It's been destroyed. The man who saved Nissan will now forever be remembered as the man who almost destroyed it. And the damage he caused extends far beyond one company. How does something like this happen? How does a CEO steal over $1 billion from a major global corporation over 2 decades without anyone stopping him? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about corporate governance, not just at Nissan, but across the global business world. Start with Japanese corporate culture. The keiretsu system, cross-shareholding networks between corporations, banks, and suppliers, creates relationships that prioritize loyalty over accountability. Nissan's board was filled with insiders, people who owed their positions to Ghosn, people who had no incentive to question him. In fact, questioning the CEO in Japanese corporate culture is often seen as disloyalty rather than diligence. Then there's the broader issue of celebrity CEOs. Ghosn wasn't just Nissan's leader, he was its brand. Magazine covers, business school case studies, government awards. When someone becomes that powerful, that celebrated, who has the courage to investigate them? Who even thinks to look? Executive compensation opacity made things worse. In Japan, detailed disclosure requirements for executive pay only existed above certain thresholds, and even then, enforcement was lax. Ghosn exploited these gaps systematically. He structured his compensation across multiple entities and jurisdictions, specifically to avoid triggering disclosure requirements. And here's the terrifying part. Nissan wasn't unique. The same vulnerabilities exist at companies around the world, the same weak oversight, the same celebrity CEO worship, the same opacity in compensation, the same conflicts of interest on boards. Ghosn's fraud wasn't an aberration. It was a case study in systemic failure. The Nissan scandal sent shockwaves through corporate boardrooms globally. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. Toyota, Honda, and other Japanese manufacturers immediately reviewed their governance structures. Boards were reorganized to include more independent directors. Executive compensation schemes were scrutinized and simplified. Internal audit functions were strengthened and made independent from management. But the impact extended beyond Japan. The scandal coincided with a broader global reckoning about corporate governance. Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos, Adam Neumann at WeWork, Travis Kalanick at Uber. A pattern was emerging. Charismatic founders and celebrity CEOs often built companies with weak controls and cultish internal cultures that facilitated abuse. Investors became more aggressive. Pension funds and activist shareholders began demanding better board oversight, clearer compensation disclosures, and stronger internal controls. The era of the all-powerful CEO was giving way to something new, or at least people hoped it was. Regulators updated rules. Japan strengthened corporate governance codes and increased penalties for violations. The SEC in the United States enhanced scrutiny of cross-border compensation arrangements. International accounting standards were tightened to close the loopholes Ghosn had exploited. But perhaps the most important change was cultural. Whistleblowers like Hari Nada, who once would have been vilified for betraying their company, were now seen as heroes. The message was clear. Speaking up isn't disloyalty. Staying silent while fraud happens, that's the real betrayal. The Nissan scandal offers clear lessons for any company operating across borders and cultures. First, no executive should be irreplaceable. Ghosn's power came from the perception that Nissan couldn't function without him. This gave him leverage to demand opacity and avoid accountability. Companies must build succession plans and distribute power to ensure no single person becomes indispensable. Second, board independence isn't optional. A board filled with insiders who owe their positions to the CEO isn't oversight, it's theater. Real governance requires directors with the courage and independence to challenge management. Third, compensation must be transparent. Complex, multi-jurisdictional pay structures aren't sophisticated, they're suspicious. If you can't explain your CEO's compensation clearly and publicly, you probably shouldn't be paying it. Fourth, culture matters more than controls. You can have the best compliance systems in the world, but if the corporate culture punishes dissent and rewards loyalty above all else, those systems will fail. Nissan had rules, they just didn't enforce them because challenging Ghosn was career suicide. The question isn't whether these lessons will be learned. The question is how long they'll be remembered. Because corporate memory is short, and history has a tendency to repeat itself. As of early 2025, the Nissan scandal remains unresolved. Not because the evidence is unclear, not because prosecutors lack determination, but because the system itself, the global system of corporate accountability, has limits. Carlos Ghosn is still in Lebanon, still giving interviews, still claiming innocence. The red notice from Interpol still exists, but it's worthless as long as Lebanon refuses to extradite him. And Lebanon has no reason to extradite him. Ghosn is Lebanese. He has connections. He has resources. The government has no incentive to hand him over to face Japanese justice. The ongoing prosecutions continue. Several former Nissan executives face charges related to the expanded fraud uncovered in 2024. Some are cooperating with investigators. Others are fighting the charges. The legal process grinds forward slowly, as it always does in complex white-collar cases. And Nissan? The company is fighting for survival. In fiscal year 2023, Nissan reported a net loss of YOROS 448, $7 billion, approximately $3 billion. This came after years of declining sales, market share erosion, and the massive restructuring costs required to clean up the mess Ghosn left behind. The company is barely profitable in most markets. Its electric vehicle strategy is years behind competitors like Tesla, BYD, and even traditional rivals like Toyota and Volkswagen. CEO Makoto Uchida has implemented aggressive cost-cutting measures. More factories have closed, more jobs have been eliminated. The company's focus has shifted from growth to survival. The goal isn't to dominate markets anymore, it's simply to remain viable. The Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance technically still exists, but it's a shell of what it once was. Joint projects are minimal. The three companies increasingly operate independently. There's talk of formally dissolving the alliance or restructuring it into something looser. The vision Ghosn built, a global automotive powerhouse leveraging shared platforms and technologies, has collapsed. Even after years of investigation, crucial questions remain unanswered. Who else knew? Forensic accountants have traced hundreds of millions in questionable transactions, but many of those transactions required approval or knowledge from people beyond Ghosn and his immediate circle. How many other Nissan executives, board members, and advisors were aware of the fraud but stayed silent? Where did all the money go? Investigators have accounted for much of it: luxury properties, shell companies, payments to associates. But there are still gaps: transfers to accounts that have since been closed, payments to entities that no longer exist, money that simply disappeared into the global financial system's dark corners. Could this happen again? That's perhaps the most troubling question. The reforms implemented at Nissan and other companies are meaningful, but they're not foolproof. Determined fraudsters with executive authority can still find ways to circumvent controls, especially when operating across multiple jurisdictions with different legal systems. Remember where we started? December 29th, 2019. Carlos Ghosn, hiding in an audio equipment case, escaping from Japan, fleeing to freedom. He escaped the country. He escaped the trial. He escaped prison. But he couldn't escape the truth. The truth is this: Carlos Ghosn saved Nissan in 1999, but he also destroyed it. He built a global alliance and left it in ruins. He was celebrated as a business genius and exposed as a sophisticated thief. His escape didn't change any of that. It only confirmed what investigators had already proven. The real scandal isn't just what Ghosn did, it's how many people helped him do it. How many executives knew and said nothing? How many board members failed in their oversight duties? How many auditors missed or ignored obvious red flags? How many regulators were too slow to act? And the most disturbing part? The fraud didn't end when Ghosn fled. New executives used the same systems, the same loopholes, the same corrupt infrastructure to enrich themselves even as the company they were supposed to serve was imploding. Over $1 billion. 20 years. Hundreds of thousands of lives affected. Workers who lost jobs. Investors who lost savings. Communities that lost economic anchors. And at the center of it all, a man who will probably never face justice, living comfortably in a mansion purchased with stolen money, still claiming to be the victim. The fall didn't end when Ghosn fled Japan. It's still happening. Nissan is still struggling. The investigations are still ongoing. The lawsuits are still being litigated. The victims are still dealing with the consequences. Carlos Ghosn escaped from Japan, but he can't escape from this. His legacy isn't the turnaround. It isn't the alliance. It isn't the innovation. His legacy is corruption, and that's a verdict. No escape, no press conference, and no amount of money can overturn.